Hi, my name is Eleanor Penny. Welcome to Novara FM and welcome as well to the first week of President Donald Trump's second term in office at the helm of the American empire. As we record, the inauguration was 2 days ago on Monday, the 20th of January 2025. His cabinet features a historic number of multimillionaires and billionaires, and one of them kicked off this second term in horrifying style at the inauguration with a gesture that looked uncannily exactly like a Nazi salute. Certainly a load of Nazis seem to think so. That man's name is Elon Musk. He's a billionaire CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. He's a self-styled tech messiah and, in a dense field, one of the worst people on the internet. He's more recently known for buying up Twitter, as was, and cozying up to the international far right and spreading right-wing conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement. And he is who we will be talking about today. Unsurprisingly, we're not going to be doing a breathless hagiography of the man and talk about him as a troubled genius who is going to save humanity by taking us to Mars. And we're not going to be speculating too much about whatever personal demons may or may not be keeping him up at night. Rather, the trajectory of someone in this position of economic, political, and cultural power can tell us a lot about the fortunes of modern capitalism and its relationship to the state, and what, if anything, we might be able to do about it. To tell us more about this strange moment in history, I'm joined now by Quinn Slobodian, who's a professor of international history at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. His books include Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and the Dream of a World Without Democracy, and coming up very soon, Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Quinn, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So, first up, for those who are, I would say, blissfully uninitiated into Elon Musk's man, myth, legend, tell us a bit more about this guy. You've written about him quite recently, very timely manner. Who is he and why are we talking about him?
Well, he's been in the news for about a quarter century by now, right? He first came to public awareness along with Peter Thiel as one of the founders of PayPal around the turn of the millennium, which became, as we know now, an extremely successful payment system, especially for kind of e-commerce and online shopping, and was actually intended at the time by Thiel himself to be a kind of stateless currency. So he was actually inspired by the work of William Rees-Mogg, among other people, father of Jacob Rees-Mogg, with the idea that proper economic freedom could only happen sort of parallel to the state rather than inside the state. So people heard about Musk first then. He was a kind of wonderkind, bought a really expensive car, crashed it, became a kind of poster child for the nerd multimillionaire. And wow, was he nerdy at that time? Not in the kind of, gaming and leather jacket nerdy, but like balding and ill-fitting kind of Costco shirt nerdy. And beyond that, he started to he was actually ended up being kind of ousted from PayPal's directorship pretty quickly, and then was fishing around for ideas. And he is in the 2000s ended up founding SpaceX, finding some people who had started a neat new electric car company called Tesla and raising capital with them to make that a going concern, obviously. Creating Starlink, which is an internet service provider from satellites. And all the while through the 2010s, sort of successfully picking up, of course, more and more publicity, a sense of being this kind of savant genius. He appeared in the Iron Man movies, appeared in Rick and Morty. It was a kind of almost cult hero of the tech boom of the millennium thus far. In the 2010s, and really after 2016, when a lot of other tech companies were having trouble, he ended up joining the kind of group of the ones that left the pack, and after 2020 was making enormous amounts of money, especially through Tesla stock, but also then now SpaceX, not to be underrated, is currently the most highly valued private startup in the world. So his personal net wealth now, tops over $500 billion. It has gone up a great deal even since inauguration. And his politics, which I'm sure we'll discuss, have kind of had their own journey. But for the most part, he's kind of, he's like a hero of the ongoing tech-driven asset bubble that is the United States, and someone who has managed to accrue legitimacy as somehow irreverent, in a way fun, willing to tweak the noses of the authorities, and also kind of willing to offer easy fixes for any of humanity's many problems.
I'd love to know more about their ideological influences, both Musk and his kind of business and ideological contemporaries, points to people like Peter Thiel and the PayPal mafia, that kind of thing. Not completely neatly slotted into this sort of classical neoliberal economic framework, but certainly seem to be swimming in similar waters. Can you tell us a bit more about that and maybe some histories that it might be useful to point to understand them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is often the question that I get from journalists is sort of like, is Elon Musk a libertarian? ? And I find that a sort of devilishly hard question to answer, but which I would mostly answer no. So I would explain that this way, that I think if you look at the ideology as stated by people like Mark Andreessen or Peter Thiel, often Balaji Srinivasan is another one. Their political position is often somewhere along this spectrum, from sort of like the state should be at arm's length and just create a framework for makers and value creators to do their thing for society with as little interference as possible. So that would be pretty classic libertarian, even neoliberal idea that private entrepreneurs and business people are the ones who are driving society forward, and the state should simply facilitate their profit accumulation through light touch regulation, creating laws that in my work I've called like encasing particular kinds of markets to make certain things possible and other things not. So to be kind of the handmaiden of capital. So I have no problem with calling someone like Thiel or Andreessen a libertarian when they're in that mode. Occasionally they edge towards a more anarcho-capitalist mode, which suggests that the state as such and representative government can be dispensed with. And that, as Thiel said around the year 2009, we need to actually exit politics altogether and create new polities. Balaji Srinivasan is the person who's laid out the most articulated version of this in his work on the network state that is quite influential. So you have, I think, those are the mainline versions of sort of free market ideology that circulate in Silicon Valley. On the one hand, the state is there to encase markets for the interest of capitalists, or the state is so pernicious that it needs to be exited altogether. I don't really, for the most part, see Musk in that spectrum. I actually see him more as someone who is operating with a vision of like a developmentalist state, almost in the kind of, South Korean or Taiwanese model of the 1980s, in the sense that in the same way that in a place like Korea, you had these like conglomerates, the chaebols, who, had an incredibly tight hand in glove relationship with the government. The government sort of did what the chaebols wanted. So you need more skilled workers. Okay, let's spend more on a certain kind of education. You need the unions repressed. Okay, let's go crack the head of the labor leaders. You need to, pivot towards this kind of export market because it's good for your bottom line and you see an edge in the global market. Let's do that. So it's not just the kind of laissez-faire, even if you want to use that term, or arm's length relationship to the state, but it's like an intensely collaborative and sort of symbiotic knitting together of what the state is and what a particular sort of capitalist leadership is. And to me, that's more like the ideology that Elon Musk operates by. He doesn't seem to have that kind of knee-jerk kind of high school libertarian attitude of the young Ayn Rand reader that someone like Peter Thiel absolutely does, right? Even when he's just tripping all over his tongue and being hypocritical left, right, and center, he'll still sort of reflexively say like, the government is the road to serfdom. Whereas Elon Musk is just kind of like, hey, what can the government do for me? So, and I think it's actually not the worst thing to sort of do to take cues from the language that he uses. One thing there's so much with Musk, it's, you forget things from week to week, but I had somehow forgotten that he had officially changed his job title at Tesla. You remember what his job title is?
Oh, God, no.
It's Techno King.
Stop it.
So he's quite literally, if you go on their webpage, he's not the CEO of Tesla. He's the Techno King of Tesla, which is like, on the one hand, as is often the case with Musk, just like a really shit dad joke. But on the other hand, it's like very diagnostic of how he sees himself, which is someone who has unique access to an understanding of the way world works, can marshal resources and deploy them. So get out of my way, peasants, right? So that idea of sort of techno-monarchism, which it has its own genealogy in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, we might get to Curtis Yarvin and neo-reaction, because that's actually the kind of vision they've laid out. It's quite certainly different from Hayek. It's even different from Ayn Rand, but it's quite a bit like the idea of the rule of techno kings.
Tell us a bit more about that.
He's now someone who I very recently thought I would never have to think about again, but now, because we have like 4,000 word interviews with him in the New York Times, as we did this week, suddenly he's unavoidable again. This fellow, Curtis Yarvin, who is he's about 50, I guess. He used to blog under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug on a very well-frequented blog called Unqualified Reservations in the early 2000s. And up to the present, actually, he has a Substack called Gray Mirror that is occasionally kind of interesting reflections on the state of politics, often incredibly bad poetry written in sort of blank verse for page after page. So it was a kind of army brat. He was part of this interesting thing I've written about elsewhere that's connected to the kind of IQ fetishism called the Center for the Study of Intellectually Precocious Youth, I think it was called. It was a kind of talent search that was set up in the 1980s to find high IQ kids and kind of take them out of regular education in the summers and give them special training, and also, it must be said, like a special elevated sense of their own self-worth and value. And that really seems to have stuck with Yarvin, because he moved out to the Bay Area, was working as a computer programmer. Blogging around 2008, 2009 was when he was blogging the most. And while he was doing that, he was laying out, with some, intention, a kind of ideological worldview, which was consciously anti-liberal in the sense of, the principles of universal representation or civil freedoms, but was also anti-libertarian in the sense he didn't want to prioritize the idea of statelessness or economic freedom above all, but was also anti-conservative. So didn't think that you should guide politics entirely according to edicts of, autochthonous national populations or linguistic purity or blood lineage or anything like that. It was what he called a neo-cameralism, and his inspiration was kind of basically early modern absolute monarchs. So people like Frederick I, who had sort of taken on modernity in some ways and sort of figured out how to deploy the new commercial classes to their own interest, but also kept a really centralized authority and power. So did kind of, top-down modernizing projects. I think of like Catherine the Great or Peter the Great as people who, did this version of kind of reactionary modernism. Plug into the global market increasingly, but don't let kind of principles of representation and democracy kind of, diffuse through the society. So keep an iron fist directing the sort of ship of state according to some long-term plan of economic development. So that was his idea, which sounds like could be really dry, but because he sexed it up with all kinds of very kind of naughty, like Swiftian scandalous tidbits. It was actually very popular and is still to this day, I think, actually pretty readable around 2008-9. So, for example, and these are the kind of things that now get exhumed from his corpus to show that he is like this monstrous character. He would do these kind of thought experiments where he would say, what if we turn San Francisco into a corporation instead of self-governed democratic city? We could call it Friscorp, and we would have all of these extra workers who might be upset. So what would we do? Well, we would seal them like worker bees into honeycombs, so kind of lock them up where they might get distressed, but we would provide them with video games and distract them and keep them entertained endlessly in a kind of Matrix type situation. And the ones who weren't useful, we would turn into biodiesel for the city's buses. So he said this kind of thing. And of course, nowadays, someone who's friends with the vice president who said that people should be turned into biodiesel, you're going to find those pull quotes. And there's been enough, I think, exposés on him and things like the New Republic and Wired and The Nation and so on. But, to focus on those totally over the line and, offensive. And there's also there was plenty of racism and sort of sexism mixed in as well, no doubt, is, I think, to kind of distract maybe from the core attraction of his philosophy for tech people like Musk and Peter Thiel, with whom he's also close, which is a kind of rationale for authoritarianism that has the patina of Western tradition and also somehow looks forward looking at the same time, because it's the idea is not you amass power and become a king simply to like sit on a pile of rubies and emeralds like some quote unquote like Oriental despot, the way like negative versions of monarchy were described during the Enlightenment. But you would be like a modernizing king. So you'd be a king who runs the territory like a CEO runs a portfolio or runs their firm, responsive to the desires of consumers, having the long-term time horizon in mind. Because you're a king, you care about what your progeny will inherit, and you care about the reputation of your kingdom. This is also the argument that the anarcho-capitalist Hans Hermann Hoppe uses to defend monarchy, which is that represented governments don't really care about the resources that they take on, because they just want to maximize their wealth in terms of votes for the next 4 years and sort of deploy the resources as quickly as they can to kind of pay out their constituents. And then they'll probably be cycled out anyway. Certainly if there are term limits, they would be. So kings are better than presidents because they care about the future. That would be the core of the argument.
I'm curious about what the relationship is between this kind of theory of political power and how political power should operate and the changing nature of American capital. You've pointed out that, or rather you've described the American economy as a kind of tech-driven asset bubble at the moment. Now, previously, it has been a kind of almost a cliche to say that liberal bourgeois democracy is capitalism's preferred mode of governance. And there seems to be a bit of a bun fight at the top of American capital, certainly, over whether or not that's true. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really captures a lot of what's happening in American politics right now. I mean, if you look at Trump's attitude towards foreign policy, this is a kind of point that a lot of international relations scholars have been making over the last couple of weeks or last couple of months, is like, why does Trump think that to have influence globally and to have sort of strategic advantage, he needs to like literally like purchase Greenland? Like, isn't precisely like the mystery and, in a way, genius and secret of American power that it doesn't have to directly administer the entire globe, and yet it can have the full advantage of access to all of its resources and directly and indirectly like kind of influence how everything happens everywhere. right? Well, obviously with some serious obstacles recently with Russia and China, but nevertheless, that what you're describing is that kind of what we assumed was like the kind of settled way of exercising power in an era after national self-determination and the principle of democracy had sort of won in the 20th century, was that you could no longer just, enslave people outright, nor could you simply annex countries outright. You needed to govern through indirect means. And hey, actually, that works just as well, if not better, because people are really good at self-exploiting and countries are really good at, obeying in advance what they think the America empire might want from them. So I think that almost every one of a kind of Marxist persuasion, or even a kind of, liberal real or even realist persuasion, would have assumed that model was basically working for American capitalists. So why change? Why rock the boat by talking about like techno kings all of a sudden? It seems extreme. And I guess I have a couple of answers to that. I mean, on the one hand, if you look at the oscillation between Democrats in power and Republicans in power in the United States over the last 25, 30 years, there's actually been a lot of continuity across the administrations, right? I mean, wages for working people have stagnated across Democratic administrations, across Republican administrations. The amount of money being concentrated in the smallest, percentile of the United States population keeps on growing. So we make more billionaires in the United States from year to year, whether it's Obama in power or Biden or Bush or Trump. That's one of the things America has been very good at, is designing like a model for the concentration of economic power and the production of ever more wealth and income inequality. So why would these people like Mark Andreessen and Vivek Ramaswamy and people like that get so agitated about which person needs to be in power, considering like manifestly, like both are working great for them? Like they actually have nothing to complain about. The meritocracy, however you want to define it, worked perfectly for them. The stock market being completely dependent on a small number of tech stocks is working great for them. The ongoing like vertical rise of Bitcoin valuation is working great for people like them who bought early and have held. So that's the first riddle, is like, why so agitated? Why not just sit back and just, how much money do you need? Like, what can you do quite literally with all this money? And then to answer that one, I think you do need to psychologize a bit and just be like, well, what did Jeff Bezos want to call Amazon.com before he called it Amazon? He wanted to call it relentless. So there is a way
these guys are so unbearable. I know it's a useful point, but God, sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So there is, like the default to just the cravenness and the clichéness of it. Maura Donegan had a pretty good piece about this in The Guardian this week, about just watching the inauguration and being like, oh my God, it's just as gross and vulgar and like obvious as I've always hoped it wasn't, but it is. Like, this is it. They want all the money. They want all the things. So, and when they look at Biden and Kamala Harris, they say, what do we see? We see some hints of antitrust legislation. We see some hints of AI regulation. We see some hints of crypto regulation. We see hints of changing the taxes when the Trump tax cuts expire in 2021. We see hints of crackdowns on mergers and acquisitions and the taxing maybe of capital gains, even if they're unrealized, in the form of these enormous stock that people are holding. And those are scary enough for them to go running for sanctuary in Trump and his people, right? So that's, I think, one explanation for this seemingly kind of this sudden swing towards disruptive forms of authoritarianism, basically. The other thing, though, that I think is important to point out, and this is kind of the point of the last book that I wrote, the Crack Up Capitalism book, is that it's not like they are without their models. So look around the world, right? Look around the world in the last 25 years and ask, who has been praised to the skies as the site of the most rapid modernization, and the new magnets and poles for the wealthy and the famous, and for ambitious, bold, and kind of grand projects of real estate construction and adaptation to the shifting needs of the global economy. Well, it's places like Dubai. And what is Dubai? It's an autocratic, extremely reactionary, and extreme, like hyper traditionalist society grafted onto 21st century turbo capitalism in a very small space, with which, for various contingent reasons that I talk about in my book, have managed to get very wealthy by basically just constantly pivoting and finding where the angle is, and taking advantage of things like Iranians offshoring their money, the Americans needing to dock their ships during the Iraq invasion, lots of other things too. So the idea of like techno monarchy is right there. You can also look, as I talk about in my book, at less well-known places like Liechtenstein, another place, hereditary monarchy, incredibly high GDP per capita, have just found their niche in the global financial wealth defense industry. Places like Singapore, I think Singapore is a very big model for this idea of sort of export economy, oriented industrial policy. This announcement just yesterday of up to $500 billion in AI development in the United States is a very Singaporean kind of a moment. Singapore was doing stuff like that in the 90s already, getting in early to tech stuff, building out their own internet network and so on, figuring out how to plug into the semiconductor industry. So I think, Silicon Valley got worried that they weren't going to be able to have it all. And then they looked around and they said, there are other models. We don't need to just do like big legacy nation states with baggy hinterlands and all kinds of useless workers. We can try to figure out how to retrofit the US into a more like decentralized, self-governed patchwork, which is incidentally the name of a book that Curtis Yarvin wrote, Patchwork, of kind of neo-feudal, sort of quasi-Europe in the year 1100 model of city-states, effectively, that can be designed as their governing class wants, and people can either opt in or opt out. So I think that's the extreme vision of which arguably something like just getting big contracts for Anduril and SpaceX could be perhaps a transitional phase.
So what kind of institutions does someone like Musk require to continue to profit as he does, right? My mind always turns when we talk about Elon Musk to his now infamous tweet, "We will coup anyone we want," which is a reference to the attempted coup of Bolivia, I believe it was, when they threatened to nationalize or reform the lithium economy, which is very important for certain tech industries. And of course, you pointed to Peter Thiel's hypocrisy, and I'm assuming that's a reference to how much of state money he ended up taking to develop many of his projects. So yeah, I'm curious as to what currently do the relationships between these forms of private industry and state violence look like, or sort of state power look like?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think it has a few elements. I think one element would be, to be able to be in a position of leverage to get the kind of regulation and deregulation that they want that serves their business interests best. So, for example, Musk has put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars. And those have obviously run into their problems. They are uncanny for people. People are maybe suspicious that these things are going to work the way they're supposed to. So there's a fair amount of regulation and needs for reporting and stuff like that on autonomous vehicles that, it would be nice for Musk to be able to do away with. So you could do something like that, just sort of wave a wand now that you're in the White House, literally. And you're not worrying about that anymore. The second way is to just have the government as a client. the teal thing wasn't so much a reference to the kind of, the way that he was institutionally supported in the development of products, but more about the U.S. as this government, the Department of Defense, as a client for Palantir, one of his most profitable enterprises. So the Department of Defense has just signed a huge contract with Palantir to do kind of internal surveillance, logistics, software for the pursuit of suspects, both domestically and international. You probably know Palantir also working with the UK government and has clients overseas as well. So the kind of money that can be made by people like Musk to become, as they already are, the kind of launch vehicle for all military satellites that NASA puts in the sky. Potentially, I would think contracts for things like Starlink for connecting remote communities, as it already functions in a place like Brazil. Starlink also famously, providing the internet connectivity for the Ukrainian forces in the field. The one big kind of revelation in Walter Isaacson's biography of Musk was that at some point when Musk wasn't sure if he still supported the Ukrainian side versus the Russian side, he threatened, and briefly did, cut off internet access for the Ukrainian front. So this is an extraordinary amount of power for private actors to obviously have over what has traditionally been kind of one of the central provinces of the state, which is matters of national security and military provision. So I think, you get internally, you get to write your own laws. You get the state as a client. And then you get the state, to get to your question about kind of foreign policy, you get the state as a kind of enforcer for your interests abroad. So I think one of the clearest material reasons for Musk in particular to get involved with the Trump campaign in the incredibly intimate way that he did in the last weeks of the campaign and into the transition period is to use the U.S. state as a battering ram for foreign markets. So we've seen this in a few different ways already. Giorgia Meloni's government has negotiated directly with Musk about having Starlink provide satellite connectivity for the Italian armed forces, which wouldn't seem that startling, except for the fact that the EU is literally in the middle of building up that exact same capacity with a massive kind of multi-country project called Iris. So for Meloni to kind of defect and say, actually, I'm going with Musk, is like already a massive win for him in terms of, peeling off people in the bloc or countries in the bloc that might otherwise feel dubious about collaborating with him. He's also, in the last week, been in conversation with the Chinese leadership, implying that there could be a kind of quid pro quo in which perhaps he buys half of TikTok, and in return, China provides access to the Chinese digital market for X users. Probably not going to happen, but this leaning on foreign markets to get better access is something for sure the EU is going to be experiencing. Roll back GDPR, stop bugging us about content moderation, and maybe then we'll go a little softer on tariffs. When it comes to the actual material supply chain that you're asking about, that's when it gets even more serious. When the idea is like, we need X rare earth mineral, we need X piece of lithium or cobalt for our products. And if you don't give them up, then, maybe there'll be military consequences. The favored tool right now is sanctions and tariffs. Like, that's how, at present, the U.S. Exercises its power most often, other than, of course, arms sales, as in the case of Israel. So I think that that's what we can imagine now, is like big tech kind of using the U.S. state as like its enforcer, like its bodyguard, basically, globally for specific interests that would vary from place to place. But I think it's worth pointing out, perhaps the biggest difference between having kind of Musk as Trump's right-hand man instead of Bannon, the way it was at this time in 2017, is that I think that Musk, in a very basic way, believes in globalization, economic globalization in particular, not in the sense of a multilateral rules-based regime governed from Geneva by the WTO or some kind of, neutral arbiter, which was never neutral, but anyway, according to some principle of free trade, but in the sense that the international division of labor is the most efficient for everybody and even most efficient for him. And so he wants to be able to pick and choose globally where he is, where his companies are, what he can get out of places, where he has customers. And that's quite different from someone like Bannon, who I think was a pretty true believer, kind of economic nationalist tending towards isolationist, who sort of envisioned a block, a transatlantic block of some kind that would be decoupled from China in an absolute way. I think that, one of the very simple explanations for why Musk jumped into the race so late was to be a kind of human shield for that kind of rhetoric, to just basically throw himself on the grenade of like economic decoupling and save the China market basically for himself. Because he's much more dovish, obviously, on China than some of the other people around Trump were, whether they were the Marco Rubio, Robert Lighthizer, even JD Vance types, or the more fire-breathing kind of Steve Bannon types. So paradoxically, even though, the techno king might be a kind of a win from the point of view of the kind of Financial Times crowd, like making sure that we don't totally become a fragmented world economy.
Can you tell us more about what you see to be the principal differences between Trump Mark 1 and Trump Mark 2 in terms of the orientations of his economic program? I think it's fair to say that in his first run for office, he was talking loads about coal miners and the Rust Belt and industrial policy. There was a kind of nativist economic nationalism. Now I think there's more of a turn towards talking about crypto and AI. And as far as Trump the man is concerned, it does often seem to be like he is really enthusiastic about the last thing he just heard, but there does seem to be some kind of shift change that we can see in the way in which he's moving with the current here.
Definitely. I mean, I think and I'm glad you said that, because I've often said that too, that I don't know where I heard it, but it still seems so right that he's just completely convinced of the worldview of the person he spoke to 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
But then, more generally, I think he's just a kind of locomotive onto which people can attach their particular political and economic projects, even if they are a kind of incoherent or at cross purposes. But I think the probably most pithy way to describe the first Trump administration was he kind of, he campaigned in that Bannonite populist poetry, but he really governed in some pretty straightforward, like libertarian prose. I mean, the tax cuts were literally written by Arthur Laffer, like of the Laffer curve that led to the Reagan tax cuts in the 1980s. And
sorry, for those who might not have heard of that.
So the Laffer curve is just this idea that that he famously like drew on a napkin and persuaded supposedly Rumsfeld to then sort of carry into the Reagan White House, that if as the curve goes up, as more of your income gets taxed, you will tend to be less productive. So at the margins, if you're 100% taxed, then you're going to be 0% productive. So to have really high tax rates was counterproductive in the mind of Arthur Laffer and the people putting together Reaganomics. And if you lowered taxes, you would actually increase revenue for the state, because people would be more motivated to go out and, be more productive, and also to invest more, hire more people. So this is the essence of so-called supply side economics, is like you actually just leave more hands in the money of taxpayers, and they will let the magic of the market, keep revenues pumping. And it simply doesn't work. Empirically, that's not true. It has never been true. And at the time, even neoliberals like Milton Friedman were like, that's nonsense. That's not right. And all we're going to do is blow up the U.S. deficit and debt if we slash taxes, but don't slash expenditure. In fact, Friedman was right, but as the sort of world historical spirits would dictate, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and later China were happy to step in and pick up that debt. So, since those tax cuts, according to this logic of tax less and magically still make more, which you might recall from your recent encounter with this philosophy in the personage of Liz Truss not too long ago, that was proven wrong. And yet, because America was in this special position of, issuing the dollar that is the world's reserve currency, people are always willing to buy up US debt and thus prevent the US from collapsing economically. So it's a very old, we're talking now 50-year-old idea from the corner of conservative libertarian think tanks, neoliberal think tanks, however you'd like to think of them, Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute. And a lot of Trump's first-term policy was along those lines, with the exception, of course, of his disruptive trade policy. But the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the Midwest was always more of a slogan than a reality. It's actually extremely hard to do, as it turns out. But I mean, they gave in a huge amount of money to TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor plant, Foxconn, the manufacturer, and it produced, very little. The administration that was a bit more serious about sort of reshoring manufacturing was the Biden administration with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which did give a huge amount of money to infrastructure and green type manufacturing projects. But that also, as we know, didn't really land with the voters, even if it did have some marginal effects from state to state, didn't have time to kind of develop enough to make people feel it, recognize it as making their lives better and turning the country around. So I think quite rationally, Trump's PR people kind of looked at 8 years of rhetoric of infrastructure bills and manufacturing, kind of, even when they were funded, cashing out as very little, and just focused on other things. And in the meantime, other things include the ridiculous drive up of the value of cryptocurrencies, which are for Trump, as they are for many people, just like conjuring value out of thin air, turning kind of clout and reputation into something, in your bank account immediately. I think that it took Trump a while to get crypto. I just don't think he knew what it was or how it worked. But I'm become convinced, based on no evidence, just my feeling, that Trump, who is already, we know, fixated on television ratings and the idea of having had the best rated show on television when he had The Apprentice as his reality TV show for many years. I think someone was just like, Donald, do you know how there's ratings? What if that was money? And he was like, oh, yes. Because, dropping the Trump coin on Inauguration Day followed quickly by the Melania coin, both of which now have valuations, I think, upwards of $1 billion, if I'm not wrong. Why bother trying to do something troublesome like reindustrializing the Midwest when you can just literally make a JPEG of yourself in a Superman outfit and make more than any of those factories are going to make in a year? So that kind of scam-based Ponzi nature of Silicon Valley's magical thinking is closer, I think, to the ideology that Trump is operating with now. And it works for him because that actually, there's a lot of young people or otherwise precariously employed people or already rich people who are also excited about the idea of turning influencing into wealth in that unmediated way through retail investing or crypto markets or building up huge followers and accounts, subscription bases, and so on. So I think that kind of this sort of hyper real quality of American capitalism right now that Silicon Valley has both contributed to and, helped accelerate and legitimate is something that Trump seems to have cottoned onto. I think also through the influence of his son, Don Jr., is repeatedly quite fixated and enamored with this world of Silicon Valley and the All In podcast. And I think he basically wants to be one of the guys. He wants to be one of the VC bros. And they've probably kept him at arm's length, but maybe just teased him along just enough to get the access that they now so richly enjoy. So I think it's, to kind of put, I guess, more of a fine point on it, I think that we're at an interesting time with this sort of big tech takeover of American politics. Because on the one hand, it just seems all like fluff and clouds and bullshit and crypto and sort of NFT as governing philosophy. But on the other hand, there's very, very real hard material processes happening here, right? So not only the incredibly voracious energy usage of things like AI, of which there was just a $500 billion investment announced yesterday, which is going to put, huge unprecedented demands on the expansion even further of fracking, the return of nuclear, doing everything except renewable energy, because that's now become ideologically toxic to the Trump administration. The things that Musk does are not necessarily only NFT based and nebulous and fake. I think the fact that he does do internet provision, that he did make the first economically successful electric vehicle, the fact that he does build these rockets that can re-land back on Earth after they've been launched. These are actually impressive feats that he has somehow been able to be part of coordinating. So, I think that's maybe the question will be less, I think, will Bannon and Miller regain the upper hand? I think basically they won't. I think they're cooked. They don't have any juice. What does Bannon have? Just looking mean at the camera? Who cares? What does Laura Loomer have at this point? I mean, what do these clowns actually mean for Trump now that he's already in office? I think next to nothing. What is there going to be another January 6th against him? It's not going to happen. He is the hegemon now, and he sucks up all of the authority and symbolic capital that exists, and he then distributes it according to his whims. But what kind of Silicon Valley we get, I think, is going to be important. Is this going to be an extension of the kind of squeeze the workers from the last drop of their labor, Uber contractor model, likely? Or could it be a more Singaporean, redistributive, social democratic, benevolent despot model? Unlikely.
So talking about January 6th, let's talk about the sea-kiling elephant in the room.
Right.
So what do you think Musk's trajectory from liberal adjacent climate guy, as he once was, right? He tweeted at one point that he was a socialist, then I believe he deleted it, very erratic, to sort of right-wing conspiracy nut. What does that tell us about the new far right / new fascism's relationship to neoliberalism and to this form of capitalist crisis? Because it's often said that fascism is a response to capitalist crisis. Fascism is sort of capitalist crisis cheat mode, right? Problem being that since the first peak of fascism in Europe under Hitler, Mussolini, those guys, neoliberalism has fundamentally reformed what nationalism might look like, because it's fundamentally reformed the nation. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an excellent question. I think maybe to take the second one first, the reason why I continue to be kind of hesitant to find explanatory value in the category of fascism, despite things like Hitler salutes, is that I think that fascism was a product of mass society, and it was a product of an industrial society in which the working class was the most consequential question for any government. What do you do with the enormous organized working class? Can you turn them into voters, a la the Social Democrats in Germany, and have socialism through a parliamentary means, or can they be a kind of revolutionary mass that can seize control, or can you somehow co-opt their energy and redirect it and turn them into servants of the nation while decapitating the leadership class, as in fascism? And then fascism, of course, doing these kind of mock versions of working class traditions in terms of acrobatics clubs and youth leagues and sort of forms of mass marshalling that were actually much more familiar to socialists, but now have been taken up and turned into fascist activities, explicitly anti-socialist ones.
Hmm.
So, as you said already, I mean, we don't live in that world anymore. We don't live in a world in which there's like a dense network of embodied civil society and kind of, leisure clubs and groups and collective living. We don't live in a world, more specifically or germanely, of people, men and young women, walking through factory doors, in the majority of the population as the way to make their daily bread. So the fascism, if you want to call it that we're looking at, isn't one that looks like that. Like, it's not one of, mass organizations and, huge rallies in the town square and the kind of industrialized slaughter of the enemies, as it turned into in the case of Germany. It's an atomized version of the same sort of reactionary anti-socialist energies. Right now, it's mediated through obviously the swarm dynamics of online behavior and often the kind of chaotic play of signifiers that we got previewed in 2016 with the alt-right, and Elon Musk now just like catches the long tail of by sort of sarcastically throwing a Hitler salute in the midst of his speech. The idea that, this is the fascist of idle surface provocation that then, produces irate reactions from opinion makers that to me doesn't coalesce as a kind of the nation in arms, as we saw in Italy and Germany. Now, I might be wrong. I mean, there are obviously mass moments as well in the current Trump formation. It was startling that so many people were willing to do something that to their high school civics lessons brains must have at some point been transgressive, to like enter the Capitol by force 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there obviously are germs of that collective action too, so I wouldn't discount it altogether. But I think that right now fascism works as a kind of reservoir of more ironic provocation in terms of its imagery than earnest kind of emulation. The fact that it's gone as far as it has with the Musk gesture, I think, is pretty striking, though. I mean, the way it's been rationalized away by everything that I've seen from the German press to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, pro-Israel, once legitimate kind of organization in the United States, is that he was using the gesture of quote unquote throwing his heart to the crowd. Now, have you ever heard of that idea before this week?
It's just nonsense. And I think,
but it's like, have you I've literally never heard of that. I didn't know that was a thing, throwing your heart to the crowd.
No, I mean, I think he didn't intend to do it in the sense that I think he intended to do like a plausibly deniable Nazi salute, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's, for me, the question is less what lies within the recesses of Elon Musk's heart personally, but like for someone who has been kind of quite successfully adaptable to various vogues within the dominant ideologies of like American capitalism across the past like quarter century, like why is that why is throwing a Sieg Heil the best thing to do, arguably, for him at that moment, momentarily embarrassing though it may be?
Yeah, well, I think that you're right about avoiding it, seeing it as a kind of as a kind of spy hole into his heart or something, because that would be the wrong way of going about it. In fact, a friend of mine framed it really well, which he's like, actually, the intention of the gesture is not to kind of express his sincere allegiance to the tenets of National Socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite, which it's intended to show that like everything is available for provocation and play, and nothing has meaning. And if you liberal scolds want to read into this particular symbol some kind of historical content, then you're foolishly missing the spirit of the times. And the spirit of the times is nothing means anything. Everything is just a chaotic, fun play of signs. And if it makes Democrats and progressives angry, then it has served its purpose. So it's like quite the opposite of, oh no, I've just accidentally, in a moment of thoughtlessness, exposed my actual, deep knowledge of German mid-century history. It's more like, I know nothing, and I'm going to actually boast about how little I know by causing a reaction from you, which is premised on your thinking you know something I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a very deeply depressing, but it doesn't surprise you at all, right? If you know that Musk is just like scrolling memes and playing video games all day long. That's what he does. So the idea of anything other than like a surface, like stimulation of his frontal cortex is like quite foreign to him. The idea of self-reflection or reflection on something having like path dependency through time or like unintended consequences is just a kind of reasoning that doesn't compute for him. And I think, it makes sense in a way. Like I was thinking about it with my students. We were talking about kind of the challenge of, generative AI and LLM models in the classroom, basically, like the way that ChatGPT now can be used to like basically game any assignment if it's text-based. And the argument for ChatGPT is like it increases productivity. And so from the point of view of like everything you're told by every like ad in a YouTube video, or, certainly by your boss, your future boss, or by like the giants of industry, or indeed if you read the Financial Times and say like, why is the US doing relatively well? They're increasing productivity. So what does it do when you don't spend like a futile like 5 hours like hacking your way through like some section of Hobbes, but like you just put in the prompt about Hobbes and then you have a paragraph, you're like, wow, I've just amped up my productivity. I just saved like 5 hours. So to me, Musk is like the avatar of that, right? It's like thoughtlessness as virtue, like lack of self-reflection is actually not, it's far from being something to be ashamed of. It's actually the edge that you have because you refuse to be self-reflective because you're on to the next task.
I mean, we could, and I'm always tempted to get like really far into the weeds of like, fascist semiotics or theory of language or whatever it happens to be, because I think that is somewhat of an impulse that shares allegiances with the kind of language games that were being played in sort of, original fascism, right? It's the sort of suspicion of the intellectual, the prioritization of action, the usage of purposeful contradiction in order to make it impossible to actually say anything, to actually leverage any critique. But what's really interesting to me is we come across so many of these contradictions. Like as soon as you start looking at someone like Musk, he's toying with nationalism or like economic nationalism in some of his statements, but he's also this kind of ultra globalist. There's all kinds of contradictions like that. And one of them that is being thought through in interesting brackets derogatory ways at the moment is this relationship with kind of borders and migration. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what someone like Musk's position on migration, globalism, borders, that kind of thing can tell us about how these problems are being worked through in this moment of capitalism in America.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to say that also that I think what you just said is actually really, really interesting and important. And I think our attempt to kind of make sense of reactionary moments like this often defaults to like the practice of intellectual history, right? Where we're just like, oh, let's construct the genealogy of this thing. Well, is it a bit of Alain de Benoit mixed with like a dash of Ludwig von Mises or whatever? And that, as you're saying, I think correctly, like misses the point that fascism itself was produced to like diffuse that form of like linear rational construction of influence. It's supposed to baffle and confuse and undermine. So that's, I think, a really important point that I should probably think about more, especially because my own practice is to do probably the thing I shouldn't be doing, the
Oh, no, so
genealogizing.
it's that's a kind of an escape hatch, right? Like
Yeah,
essentially
it's a slender reed to hold on to. But no borders. So this is, of course, was like the big dust up, like before Christmas, right? That many people are like, oh, here we go. You know, dissensus in the MAGA camp. You have Ramaswamy and Musk basically saying, what's wrong with H-1B visas? Those are temporary worker visas that people get, usually skilled workers, to come to the US for a temporary period of time. There's no path to citizenship. Silicon Valley depends heavily on these to staff things like sort of back office work, basic programming, and things like that. It produces a nice kind of supine white collar working class because they have the threat of deportation, basically, and they have a work visa that's tied to the workplace, so they can't go elsewhere if they are being treated poorly or if they don't like their boss. So that idea went straight against the kind of more racially coded nativism of Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer. I think were the ones taking up the brickbats against them most directly, saying like, this is not what we supported. This is not real MAGA. Like, we want those jobs for real Americans from here. I think they even said like, like European derived, like there was some very like heavy duty, not dog whistling, just statement of like, these are for white people kind of statements. And to which Ramaswamy responded like with some very much like Dinesh D'Souza circa 1985 kind of rhetoric about like, well, the good thing about, Asian families is they give good values to their kids and they turn off the TV and make them do their homework. Following his own mentor, Amy Chua at Yale Law School, who was the mother of the Tiger Mother idea, which was quite influential in the US for a while. Same idea. Asian values, itself a reboot of like Lee Kuan Yew fixation from the 1980s and 90s. This seemed to many people like the sign of kind of cracks to come, that Musk and Ramaswamy seem to be taking a more economistic attitude towards immigration that seemed to go against the sort of closed borders rhetoric, or hard borders rhetoric, I should say, of Trump in the campaign. But I actually don't think it's much of a contradiction at all. I think that you can easily do both. I think they will. I think they're going to continue to staff those needed positions. You think that $500 billion of AI investment is going to somehow not require some people from like Bangalore to come over and help out? And of course, you still just, beat up some kids and beat up some moms and, throw some guys with tattoos in the back of cars and tape it all and, show what tough guys you are. So you can do I think the sadistic border theater with kind of undocumented, which is, by the way, if opinion polls show, overwhelming support from the American people. I think 83% was the poll I just saw for deportation of people without, quote unquote, illegal immigrants in the country.
Wow. That's
very, very high. Those aren't H-1B people, right? That's not the guy or the woman in the back of X, like working on their API or whatever it is. So, so that apparent contradiction, I think, isn't one at all. And I think that Musk is someone who sees borders as more fungible than just those of the nation. I talked about this a bit recently, but I think that if you think about his upbringing in apartheid South Africa, and the way that he seems to kind of go back to kind of post-apartheid South Africa as a version of the bad future, but also one that he sort of understands, that is a place of like deeply fragmented kind of governance and jurisdictions. Not only was his childhood in South Africa the time of the creation of Bantustans, in which, Black South Africans were being forcibly kind of repatriated and often relocated to these fake countries and then being told, there you go, you got a country now, in the worst part of the nation that you will still have to commute from for your labor purposes in the city. And of course there was lots of armed compounds and sort of self-sufficient gated spaces then, and even more so now. So I think that's, to be honest, I don't think Trump or Musk worries too much about the border, because I don't think he sees the nation as a smooth inhabited space. I think he sees it as a bumpy space in which there are first of all, states that have different laws and different inducements to investment, and then second of all, smaller cities, and then armed residences such as the ones he lives in that one can retreat to. So you don't really need to worry about the sort of legacy nation that much, except for instrumentally.
So, where next for someone like Musk? What do you think his endgame might be within the administration? Obviously, Trump is kind of famously erratic. He keeps falling out with his inner circle and getting a new inner circle every 5 minutes. So, I'm wondering how that might play into a sort of long game for someone like Musk in terms of what the problems that he sees Trump as the solution to, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess talking about the long game for Musk, one is forced to talk about his like multi-planetary goals, right? So that, I mean, for him, confessedly, his long game is to occupy and colonize Mars. And it's not for nothing that Trump mentioned that in his inauguration speech, right? And we're going to colonize Mars. Like he actually finished, did an applause line with that. So that's there. I think that's a good legitimating storyline for Musk and many of these people is like, we're not just doing it for ourselves. We're not even just doing it for America. We're doing it for humanity. Altman just said that. Sam Altman just said that about the big OpenAI investment a couple of days ago. Totally unclear why the same things that Silicon Valley has done for the last 25 years that have like overwhelmingly enriched a small number of people in many cases, exposed the rest of people to new forms of either psychological distress or employment precarity should somehow be great for humanity. But there it is. That's the way they talk about it. In terms of the medium term, like the next 4 years, I think that one thing about Trump, he may be inconsistent and wayward in his attentions, but he understands money and he understands where the rich people are. And Elon Musk is just a very, very rich man, right? I mean, he has over $400 billion as a net worth. By contrast, some of the like very, very wealthy people in Trump's cabinet have like $1 billion. So he's like 400 times richer than anyone involved in the Biden administration. The Biden cabinet, for comparison, had a net worth of $118 million. So we're talking about people who are someone who is like orders of magnitude richer than anyone else around him. And I have to think, and I do think, that gives him a certain amount of leash and leverage that the other people who Trump has gotten annoyed with don't have. I think that it means that his defection could have consequences. So if it's not impossible for me to imagine a kind of disgruntled Musk doing something like what Balaji Srinivasan did during COVID, which is like move his operations to Singapore. Could Musk just be like, screw you, I'm operating out of Beijing now? He could. He might. It's not impossible to imagine. Could he say, I'm operating out of Dubai now? I'm merging with the public investment fund in Riyadh, and we are going to like do green hydrogen and go to Mars from the Saudi peninsula? Why not? I think that those are perfectly plausible and not at all inconsistent with his own sort of statements and worldview. He doesn't give a shit about America. I mean, and neither do I. So I don't actually find that a negative trait on his part. But and Trump knows that, I think. He knows the deal, he knows negotiations, and he knows when his negotiation partner is holding a better hand than he does. So I think it will not be Trump who kicks Musk out of the White House. I think it will be Musk's own hyperactive need to constantly do 17 things at once, while also playing a lot of video games and, from the reports, doing a lot of ketamine. Not easy thing for someone to accomplish. So, physiologically, things might not last 4 years, and psychologically, they probably won't either. So what I would say if I was a betting man, the most likely option is give him a year, then he just, steps out of Washington, D.C. directly and just sort of gets his leverage at arm's length from the federal government. But I think those options of like exit and kind of fusing even more with the executive are also on the table.
I like that. Say what you like about Elon Musk, he sure does a lot of ketamine. But apart from the chemical option, we're kind of left with a question of, okay, looking at someone who is can look at other billionaires and like laugh, how broke they are.
Yeah.
What is to be done? Like, where are the potential cracks that might come within the power base of someone like Musk?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, the success of Silicon Valley has been to produce the ecosystem within which all public discourse happens, and to create the conditions within which we can express ourselves to each other in any way. So, if we write an email, we're writing through a Google platform, or at least I am. Whether I do my private email or my university, which is contracted with Google, that's all happening through, Sergey Brin's kind of baby, Larry Page. Is it surprising? Because I still think it is a little bit that, the entire leftist intellectual class can be outraged from day to day with the actions of Elon Musk, and yet X is still very much a used platform. I mean, like almost, the number of people who have left it in protest is much, much smaller than the people who have just stayed and kept on posting away. So if even that kind of a symbolic act can't be performed, I mean, the level of willingness to make even small personal sacrifices for a larger political project is like pretty low. It's not very encouraging, right?
You're calling me out here.
I'm calling myself out. I'm calling us all out. It's not, so in other words, like, we're faced with the problem where like we're swimming in the water that they have provided. And it's become impossible to imagine what life would be like on land instead of in water because we've been in it for so long. But that is the kind of, I think, Copernican kind of shift in thinking that will have to happen. We need to like get used to walking on land again after like enjoying the water or something. I don't know if total defection can work or alternative platforms, blah, blah. But it's certainly a demobilized time in the United States. There's none of the kind of popular anger and uprisings that were happening after the first Trump election, or indeed during 2020, biggest street protests in American history. Let's not forget, successfully diffused, attacked by the right, and co-opted and removed of any purchase by corporations and institutions, and turned into matters of bureaucracy and compliance and signaling and token messaging rather than something structural. So I think it's a real challenge. I think that if we pay with their money and we talk to each other with their money and we spread our every last idea with their services, then it's difficult to know how one can escape that kind of hegemonic capture.
Right. So eat your vegetables, nationalize your lithium, and for the love of God, stop tweeting. Quinn, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You too. Thanks a lot.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.